The National Association of Realtors recently made a change to the Code of Ethics and adopted Standard of Practice 10-5, which prohibits realtors from using harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on any of the protected classes in Article 10.
We talked to Matt Difanis about how that impacts you right here on Talking Real.
Welcome back to Talking Real, brought to you by the Oklahoma Association of Realtors. This is episode 165 of Talking Real. Nabil.
I just did a little double take on 165. I don't know why. I knew it was 165.
Those numbers just keep going up. We've been doing this for quite a while now. Feels pretty good. But how are you today?
I'm doing great.
Good.
Got my jacket on.
Hey.
Don't want to have my jacket on, but have my jacket on.
It's a wild time out there. We hope everyone is, conducting themselves accordingly with the typical Oklahoma
conducting themselves accordingly.
Yeah. That's old lawyer talk, actually. It's a way to sign off a letter. Conduct yourselves accordingly. It's a old time lawyer way of back in the day. That's how they would sign emails or not emails, but letters.
That's really funny.
Now I like to do it occasionally passive aggressively.
I like that.
Yeah. So conduct yourselves accordingly. This week on Talking Real, we've brought in special guest Matt Difanis. I kind of said gassed a little weird there, but Matt Difanis. And so Matt is a realtor, but the reason we brought him in today is that he was the chair of the National Association of Realtors Professional Standards Committee when they were considering the changes to Article 10, specifically the addition of Standard of Practice 10-5, which has been quite the buzz and talk in realtor land for the last year or so. So we wanted to bring him to talk about that, talk about why they went through that process. And Matt is just such a wealth of knowledge. He's got a fantastic background, a ton of information, and I really enjoyed this conversation we had with him.
Yeah, me too. As we're doing this intro after this conversation, I just realized a question that I wanted to ask him that I forgot. Because, it was really interesting to listen to what spurred everything. And I don't know if you know this, but what prompts a change to the code?
It can come in through suggestions of people through that I think are filtered through OAR staff. And again, it just kind of works through the committee process where there's ultimately a suggested change that goes before the National Professional Standards Committee. They review it and determine, yes, we want to add this in, or no, we don't. If they do make a change, then that has to go before the National Association's Board of Directors, and the Board of Directors ultimately adopts it. And then it gets disseminated down to everybody else where we all play by the same code. So that's how this process worked to make that change. And so in this conversation, we go into details about what that what that change is, sort of the conversation that existed around why that whole situation came up, and just some philosophy and thoughts behind that change that was made. So I think this will be really insightful for people, and hopefully you all enjoyed the conversation as much as I did.
That's right. So let's get right to it with Matt.
Let's go. We're joined here on Talking Real by a special guest, and I've been really looking forward to this one, Nabil. I'm very excited about this. We've got Matt Difanis on the line with us, and he is a broker owner of Remax Realty Associates from Champaign, Illinois. And Matt, we're just really excited that you gave some time to us to talk about a very important topic when it comes to the world of what realtors have to deal with and the importance of the Code of Ethics. Because today we're going to be talking about professional standards and specifically the changes to Article 10 and 10.5, specifically the standard of practice. But first, Matt, we want to introduce you to all of our listeners who may not have had the pleasure of seeing you speak and take part in some of the other great things that NAR's put on and other associations. So give us a little bit of your background in real estate. And again, we're just excited to have you here digitally in Oklahoma.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's really exciting to be in Oklahoma, and I wear a lot of hats. I am a practitioner. I've been in the business for 23 years, started doing this right out of college. I'm a multi-office broker owner, but in a small metro area. I'm in Champaign-Urbana, which is about 250,000 people, and the University of Illinois flagship campus is here. So I'm surrounded by cornfields. I'm not, people think Illinois and they think Chicago. And I do work directly with clients. So I work with clients, I lead a high producing team, and I'm a multi-office broker owner who's actively involved in company leadership. And I also do have a law school education to boot. So all of those different hats and credentials, come in handy at different times.
So you managed to go to law school, but evade the actual practice of law. Or did you practice for a while? I've been trying to figure out how to get out of it.
Right. It was right before there was the mandatory sale of soul to Satan. I was like, oh, I could stay in real estate brokerage.
Oh man, I just signed that one away when I went to law school. Goodness.
Jeff was a bad lawyer. He didn't read the contract.
So, Matt, we wanted to bring you on today to talk about professional standards. And you have played a big role in some of the changes with professional standards at the national level and the Code of Ethics. And I know this is certainly a passion project for you. So give us a little bit of your background in the professional standards world that we deal with on a day-to-day basis here as realtors.
Sure. So in 2020, I had the privilege of serving as the chair of the NAR Professional Standards Committee, and that's distinctly different from being involved at the local or the state level because, of course, the actual changes to the Code of Ethics or official guidance for the interpretation of the code all comes from that national committee. And it is a very large, very broad, and very representative committee. It's over 100 members, and it includes members from every single state in the country. And so we are collectively the keepers of the code. And just by way of history, it's important to note these changes are all part of Article 10, this new standard of practice. Article 10 is the anti-discrimination fair housing article. It's worth noting, and something I don't take lightly, that for decades, the first few decades of the existence of the code, there was a housing discrimination mandate. Realtors could be brought up on ethics charges for, under the old Article 34, realtors should not be instrumental in introducing any race of occupancy whose presence shall be deemed injurious to property values. So back in the day, I bring a black resident onto a white block, and I, as a realtor, was prohibited and could be sanctioned for it. So we were way on the wrong side of fair housing for decades. So there's some baggage, some historical baggage that members often, I didn't understand that until quite recently. So that's a backdrop against which a lot of our recent changes are set.
I appreciate you mentioning that because today, especially realtors entering the industry today, can look at Article 10 and we can look at the history of the Fair Housing Act and have the impression that maybe we were always on the right side of history. And that's not the case, because when the Fair Housing Act was originally starting to be proposed, I know that as an association, we were strongly against that as well. And so I think we need to recognize that reality of where we've been historically. And that's not to say that, we haven't come a long ways, but that also means that we need to continually make it a priority that fair housing is important, that, doing everything we can to absolutely fight against discrimination. And so I really appreciate you bringing that point up, because it's important to know where you come from to understand why this is so important, I think.
NAR, to an extent, is a victim of its own success. So I'm in my mid-40s. I've done this for 23 years. The Fair Housing Act predates my birth by several years. And so my entire life has been in the era of, at least legally, fair housing. So people my age or younger would never have known NAR as anything other than an authentic ally in the cause for fair housing. And yet our role, being on the wrong side of it, is an understatement. Literally, the National Association was distributing forced housing kits to equip state and local leaders in vociferously, strenuously opposing fair housing proposals at the state and local level during the 1960s. And when it became the law of the land at the federal level in 1968, it was 6 more years before the last vestiges of discriminatory language were finally taken out of the code, and Article 10 debuted, which at that time just mirrored the basic requirement that had already been federally mandated for 6 years.
Man, I appreciate that history. Mm-hmm. It's something that I think gets lost a little bit. And, for those that are listening, just that reminder that Article 10 is our article of the Code of Ethics that prohibits discrimination in our business practices that relate to any of the federally protected classes, as well as gender identity and help me out
Sexual
here.
orientation.
Sexual orientation. Thank you. I just had a slip of the brain there on the spot. So we've even expanded it a little bit beyond what is required by federal law, which I think is, and federal law is trending in that direction as well. And then with respect to 10.5, Nabil, you had that pulled up there, the exact language. And I think it merits us just real quick reading what standard of practice 10-5 is, so it's fresh as we about to get ready to talk into this. So Nabil, what does that say there?
10-5 says realtors must not use harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity.
So Matt, help us out here. And I guess start out by telling us what spurred the Professional Standards Committee at NAR to look into this policy change, this standard of practice change.
So the issue of discriminatory hate speech by realtors is not new. That's existed for a long time, but it proliferated in 2020. And it has always been a tip of the iceberg issue, meaning that when I say it proliferated, it was that it just more of the iceberg became visible. So just to give some specifics, NAR was hearing about 1 or 2 or 3 cases a year from state or local leaders saying, we got a really egregious case of a member engaging in this. Help us out. How do we deal with this? And really egregious cases were being dealt with through as a violation of membership duty, and hearings were being held for that. Or in the case of somebody who was, posed an imminent threat to the public safety, they could be expedited out of the organization really fast. But we went from a couple of these a year to more than 100 in the last half of 2020. And so multiple state and local association leaders wrote to then NAR President Vince Malta, asking for better tools to deal with this. That membership duty lane is not equipped to be stress tested with a whole bunch of these. So President Malta then kicked it to pro stands. He didn't say fix it. He didn't say do something. He said look at it and see if this is something that can be addressed within your lane. And that's what ultimately got the ball rolling.
Gotcha. So can you give us a little bit of background on the complaints that were being received? What kind of things was NAR hearing about?
So a lot of them were social media, although that is not the exclusive venue for such things, but a lot of them were social media. There were a lot that were egregious, but the worst that comes to mind was in the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd killing, a former Realtor member on Long Island shaking an AR-15 assault rifle into his camera, saying that he had just bought this MFer, had just spent $1,500 on this MFer, and he could not wait to use it on some N-words. It's just abhorrent, reprehensible language. And we had a literal stack of hate speech in our meeting agenda materials when I convened a special meeting of that committee on June 29th. On the LGBTQ front, we had another member who was posting on Facebook, and in that case on his business page, homosexuals and lesbians are guilty of murder according to the scriptures. And literally, like in the timeline right above that, look at these fine listings. Homosexuals and lesbians are guilty of murder according to scripture. Look at these other fine. It was real estate, hate speech, real estate, and that it's important for members to understand that is not victimless. That hurts real people. If you're the person or if you're in the class that stuff is directed at, it is soul crushing. And especially if it's part of an onslaught that's happening repeatedly, it's like somebody taking a pickaxe to your soul over and over and just chipping one piece away at a time. So it's very important, and I'm a white guy in my mid-40s. It's super important that people who look like me recognize just how hurtful and crushing it is for the people it's actually aimed at. And so that's part of it. And then the thing that all of us as realtors should be united by is the fact that then when that stuff happens and it goes viral and it gets picked up in the news, even when it's done outside of work, in the first sentence or two, it's always mentioned that person, the perpetrator, is a realtor. And then this clever ad campaign that NAR has done in recent years that focuses on all that is good about realtors, most of which is outside of work, that's who we are. Well, then that becomes who we are for that news cycle. That hurts every single one of us by painting us with whatever that particular news cycle's realtors behaving badly, hate speech gone wild episode is. And that's not acceptable. It hurts all of us, and that's not acceptable.
So before it applied to actions that were related to real estate, but now it's actions in all aspects. Can you explain that distinction and where that comes in?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So in modern history, the code of ethics could only be applied and enforced against a realtor on the basis of activity within the confines of a real estate transaction or other real estate related activities. The problem with this discriminatory hate speech is so often it was occurring outside of work, but those are the stories that still were making news. The person still gets ID'd as a realtor. And so the issue that we debated was that, you can't really say, especially with realtors, you talk to a realtor about being off the clock, and but watch how fast they clock back in when a hot lead comes in at 7:30 at night or at some crazy weekend or holiday hour. And so the idea is, to use a Mr. Rogers neighborhood analogy, to say we're only going to enforce this within the workplace is the equivalent of saying I can walk in at the beginning of Mr. Rogers, I can take off my realtor workplace sport coat, I can put on my Matt Difanis private bigot cardigan because now I'm at home, and private bigot cardigan wearing Matt can go hammer out on social media god-awful discriminatory hate speech and say, oh, no, you don't understand. That in no way interferes with my ability to live up to either the letter or the spirit of my Article 10 obligations when I'm clocked in at work tomorrow. That simply isn't realistic. And the reality is, every time a realtor is doing that, they won't even know what potential clients don't walk across the threshold of their office someday in the future, because that discriminatory hate speech on social media or wherever else it was overheard just shrunk the availability of real estate services to that protected class by that much with that episode.
Well, I think if you're looking at it too, where there are groups of people who historically have not had access to real estate, and it's been extraordinarily difficult to enter into real estate ownership, and there's already so many hurdles, and then they see something like that, I don't see how realtors can sit back and say, we're going to allow that to happen, because that's absolutely going to make somebody think that all realtors, this is how stereotypes of industries get. I mean, there's lawyer jokes for a reason, right? There are, people talk about used car salesmen, and like, we don't want that to get into a category. And, we've seen this happen. We just saw the big Newsweek thing that came out up in New York when that issue came out.
Newsday
that came out. And so this clouds the entire industry, where there's this perception of we are still propagating these discriminatory practices, and the rest of us that don't do that are adamantly against it, have to take action against it to not allow those people to call themselves realtors. I mean, I think that's vitally important to do that. But some people have been concerned about, in response to this, their right to free speech. I'm sort of air quoting here, because we can certainly talk about the legalities of the First Amendment and how this is not applicable to that. But, that right to free speech, or sometimes sharing their opinions about politics and religion, and to think that perhaps that's going to be a problem here. And so I'd like to kind of get your take on how these code changes work in light of some of those concerns, and why maybe they're not a concern.
Sure. And I genuinely respect and understand where all of those concerns come from. Nobody who was a critic of these proposals before they passed, nobody was looking at the stack of hate speech and saying, I stand in defense of that. Nobody would. But the concern more generally was, hey, wait a minute. And I'm going to tick off a whole bunch of the types of responses I have personally been on the receiving end of. I thought I woke up in a free country. This is cancel culture on steroids. When did NAR become a communist organization? This is a knee-jerk reaction. This is half-baked. This is the result of a political correct reflex. All of those things on it. And I truly respect where that comes from, because realtors are an interesting lot. Realtors, by and large, are going to be self-employed. They're very entrepreneurial, and they tend to be small L libertarian, i.e., I like charting my own path, and by extension, I really don't like being told what to do. And so that's me. All of that is me. So this is not some communist takeover. Now, the legal answer on the free speech argument is as you and I know from a legal and constitutional law background, the First Amendment literally does not apply here. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't and that NAR doesn't respect members' free speech. But remember, the First Amendment is designed to limit the government's ability to trample on people's right to free speech. We've all been subject to other organizations, private organizations, non-government actors being able to limit free speech. I've told agents in my firm, well, of course you have to abide by the law and by the code, but I reserve the right to fire you for being tacky if I don't like it. Or if you say something that just embarrasses me or the company, your head will roll. You won't work here anymore. So we're all subject to that. And the idea here is the target was very narrow. It's discriminatory hate speech with lots of specific examples that really needed to be addressed. And then the other side of that you referenced is, well, so is this coming after my politics? Is this coming after my religion? And the target was very narrow, and the answer to both of those is no. Politics is not a protected class. Political party is not a protected class. So that's not going to be an issue at all. And we also want to be sensitive to, well, gosh, if I'm at a socially conservative evangelical church, is the Sunday school lesson I taught last Sunday suddenly going to make me accused of engaging in anti-LGBTQ hate speech? Well, I gave the example earlier of what anti-LGBTQ hate speech would potentially look like. Guilty of murder, putting out there publicly, specifically directed at LGBTQ folks, as opposed to a mainstream evangelical love the sinner, hate the sin if it's a church that doesn't recognize same-sex marriage, for example. So our next order of business in the Professional Standards Interpretations and Procedures Advisory Board, the more specialized in the weeds group, is to start cranking out case interpretations, case studies that will be official guidance. And the first batch of those are going to be aimed specifically at those issues to make clear this is not going after people's religion. You have to be exceeding that hurdle of harassing speech, hate speech, epithets, or slurs based on.
I think that's helpful. I've had some people raise concerns to me, and I've tried to tell them, look, the sky's not falling. Like, this is a narrow change. This is not broad, that anything you say that we decide we don't like, we're going to say you're in violation of the code of ethics. So certainly try to explain to people that this is very narrowly tailored. This is not a huge, broad, sweeping change, and it's targeted to get very specific types of what just about anybody would say is unacceptable speech, unless it's the person saying it. And so I'm glad to see that those case interpretations will be coming out. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to talk about those on the podcast. We're going to definitely be doing all the training we can. We do a lot of training for our Professional Standards Committee as well, so that when these issues do arise, hoping they don't, but if and when they do in our Professional Standards Committees, that we'll make sure they're fully trained on it and all that. So that's great that NAR is working on those things.
And now it's important for the rank and file members, well-balanced realtors who are productive in the field. They're not obsessing over the pro standards lane. They don't know all of the procedural safeguards. But part of why the pro standards lane was the logical one to address these issues is that most members don't know this, but there's literally 300 pages of codified due process protections. It's the professional standards. It's the Code of Ethics and Arbitration Manual. It's our Bible for how these things are handled. So this new standard of practice already has hundreds of pages of procedural guardrails to protect our members. And so for members who aren't aware, if the concern is, well, what if an overbroad net snags me in a 10-5 complaint that I believe is not just, it's got to make it past grievance, meaning the allegations have to at least constitute a possible violation. Well, if somebody says, I saw that you were at the Capitol riot on January 6th, but you weren't visible or audible using hate speech, well, no, that's not 10-5. That shouldn't make it out of grievance. And then if it goes to a hearing, the respondent has the right to challenge any of the panelists for bias before they are impaneled. And then the burden is on the complainant to a strong, clear, and convincing level of proof. And after all of that, if the person still believes it was an unjust outcome, then there's a right of appeal in front of an even more specialized group of volunteers. So I just say that to underscore the point. Not only is the target narrow, not only is that bar quite high to get over that, but there's hundreds and hundreds of pages, as well as a ton of training that you happen to personally be responsible in your state for ensuring that well-trained volunteers apply those rules justly.
That's going to be, I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done, I guess, in ironing all that out. And the Code of Ethics is established to help with the professionalism and uphold a standard practice of care. How will this change to 10-5 lead and strengthen the professionalism of realtors and be a positive change in the industry?
Well, when you think about it, this is to be able to hit that target that goes into people's private hate speech. We had to open up the code to be enforceable against all of a realtor's activities. Now, again, before people think, well, holy cow, now there's professional standards police sniffing around my entire personal life. Every other article of the code is limited to real estate related activities, except maybe Article 15, and that's still about not making false or misleading statements about other real estate professionals. So all the other articles are related to real estate by their nature. We opened up the entire code so that it will apply to all of a realtor's activities, really so that Article 10 is the only one that effectively reaches outside of real estate. And so the idea is not only is this going to hopefully create a meaningful deterrent to stop this kind of discriminatory hate speech behavior, but it meaningfully raises the bar. And I go back to that First Amendment issue, which is when I say the government can't, well, who's the government in our lives as realtors? It's the licensing authority. They're the very ones where if you start engaging in discriminatory hate speech in the course of your transaction, they'll go after you. HUD will go after you. You'll be exposed to multiple layers of liability. But if you're a raging bigot in your personal life while still wearing that realtor brand, the government can't go after you for that, even though it's still hurting the real estate market. And this is a good opportunity for me to point out for people that say, hey, NAR, get back in your lane. This has nothing to do with helping me sell real estate. NAR's current mission statement is to empower realtors as they preserve, protect, and advance the right to real property for all. Preserve, protect, and advance the right to real property for all. This discriminatory hate speech was meaningfully impeding access to real property for all, including private hate speech. So not only do we think this meaningfully raises the bar on professionalism, but literally nobody else could do it. The government can't do it. The free market can't do it. I bounced a couple of people off my roster last year for racially insensitive stuff, but they both got picked back up in less than 24 hours. They weren't on the sidelines for any time at all. And so once again, the free market wasn't taking care of it. My getting them off my roster didn't mean they and I'm not saying their heads needed to roll, that they needed to be kicked out of the business, but there was no sanction, no penalty of any kind.
Yeah. And that's the difficulty. There's no repercussions for it until now, which I think is important for sure. So, again, you mentioned there were concerns of, we're opening the whole code up to now being around our personal lives, and mentioned that the other articles only apply to, real estate related activities. Are there any other changes that deal with activity in personal lives that Professional Standards Committee is looking at right now that you're aware of, or is this kind of the sole thing that's been considered at this point?
Nope, this is it. All of these changes have been focused around this narrow target. And so while somebody who, as I said, has a better balanced life than I do, who just gets a news flash about the changes, well, they may think, well, holy cow, that sounds overbroad. That sounds like it could be abused. I want to reassure those members that it really isn't. Yes, the whole code's opened up, but that really means Article 10. And what that really means is don't be a spewer of bigoted hate speech, which your members aren't doing anyway, we hope. We know it's a very small percentage, but it really was important that this officially be condemned and something that realtors can be sanctioned for or potentially suspended or kicked out of the association for.
So Matt, as we're kind of reaching the end of our time here, one, this has been a fantastic conversation and I find very helpful and enlightening, but I want to give you an opportunity to give us some of your final thoughts on why realtors should really be happy about this change, how it's going to build trust in realtors with the communities that we serve, and again, why this is such a positive change that we should really be embracing.
I'm going to be really direct and brutal with history for a minute here. None of this stuff was on my radar screen as a white guy until just the last few years, and it's a very improbable series of events and places I've been that have made, I did not come out of the womb as a social justice activist. But you have to appreciate the history to fully understand why it's important to lean hard in the right direction on this. In my home state, Chicago is a tragic poster child example of all of the evil things that the real estate industry and the realtors have done to the black community, brown and black, but in particular the black community. We're coming up on the 100-year anniversary of Black Wall Street being torched in Oklahoma. That is emblematic of what was happening across the country. The black community was shut out because of realtors, was shut out of the ability to have access to mainstream financing. So then you cut off the access to funds. The black population is then prohibited by racially restrictive covenant from going into new developments and suburbs. Cut off the money, trap them in their communities, then burn their communities down or bomb them if they try to get out of their communities or get ahead. I can't overstate how bad that history has been. And then you say, if you're a white guy that looks like me, well, okay, but we solved that decades ago. But the hangover effect, which often exists outside of my field of view, and the biggest reason I'm so aware of it now is because I've been blessed with some utterly life-changing, transformative friendships with people that come from the black community in throughout the country. But the hangover effect from those organizational sins of the past remains very pronounced. It's not the reason that my classmates, that my peer group, when I was growing up in school, they weren't living under legalized discrimination, but the stuff that we as realtors did to their parents and grandparents are the reason that they didn't have the intergenerational wealth engine of home ownership, making it a sure thing that their parents would have the money to send them to college. I never had to worry about that. My parents weren't wildly high earning, but we had a multi-generational history of building wealth and having something to pass down from homeownership. So that's really an important thing to not lose sight of, particularly in your state as you come up on the 100-year anniversary of such a seminal event.
Very insightful. We're definitely looking at how we can get involved in that event as well as that centennial comes up, because it is a tragic history that I only recently learned, living in Oklahoma my entire life, only recently learned what that history looks like, how it was very much glossed over, wasn't taught in schools, renamed to kind of hide the characteristics of the reality of that. And, we're probably going to do an episode specifically on that as that comes up as well. So Matt, this has been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank you so much, first of all, for the work that you've done, because you mentioned how many hats you wear just in business, but also leading the charge sometimes when you are at NAR on some of those things. I know you do a lot of speaking, so you really get out there and give a lot of your personal time on this kind of stuff. And I just want to personally say thank you for all that you've done, because I think it is meaningful and impactful, and it's going to leave a positive, lasting impression on the association that is just going to improve us and raise the bar as things go forward. So thank you so much for that. And we really appreciate you cutting out a little bit of time for us here in Oklahoma to join us on Talking Real.
Guys, it has truly been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And this issue just happened to come barreling down the lane I happen to have been positioned in. But it was not something I expected. It has been a true honor to carry the torch, and conversations like these are really, truly a pleasure to have. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. As always, we want to thank our guests when they give their valuable time to us just for free. It was just a volunteer thing for Matt to give us some time to come in and have that conversation, and really appreciate it. Again, I thought it was insightful, provide some great information on those professional standards changes, and I hope everybody has a little better grasp of what's going on there.
Right. Yeah. These changes don't come out of thin air. There's a lot of rationale, a lot of thinking, and like you were saying, there's still a lot of work to be done to kind of really hash this out and, give like precedents and examples and all the legal lawyery stuff.
Right.
So that, there's still work to be done.
Absolutely. So there's always going to be work to be done, that's for sure. But more on this specific change that was made that'll provide those case interpretations, all that stuff like you just mentioned. So it's a work in progress. But again, I think it was a good change. I think that it's something that will make our association stronger in the long run and in the short term. I think it's just a positive direction to move in. And I hope everybody else does too.
Right. And really ups the game of professionalism.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Real quick, if you've made it this far with us, we want to let you know that we're having the second half of Capital Conference coming up. As those of you who attended will know, we had our main day of Capital Conference, but we have now scheduled a day at the Capitol, a Realtors Day at the Capitol coming up on May 19th.
That's right.
That we'll be doing that. Is that still up on the webpage now? Where do they go find information about that?
That is up on the webpage. If you go to OKRealtors.com/events, you should see it there. Or if you go to OKRealtors.com/Capital Conference, there's a link to the event there as well. But this is in person.
Absolutely.
So we can all get back out there. We'll have ice cream and lunch.
Yeah. Gonna have some food trucks out there.
All the great stuff. And you get to meet with your legislators and chat with them about realtor issues.
Absolutely. So I hope you guys can join us for that. So go on over there to the website and check out the information on that event. We look forward to seeing you out at the Capitol on May 19th.
That's right. Oh, and it's free.
Of course it is. Of course it is. So come have lunch with us and your legislators.
That's right.
So thanks again for joining us on another episode of Talking Real. And we look forward to having you back next week, where we're going to have a conversation, a little foreshadowing here, with Lee Caesar Jr. And we're going to be talking about all kinds of things related to appraisals. There's going to be some really great tips in there for how you can help manage appraisals on behalf of your clients. So you do not want to miss that episode.
That's right. I'm really excited about that one.
Absolutely.
And if you haven't done so yet, hit that subscribe button so you know when that next episode is out. And share this podcast with a fellow realtor.
Absolutely.
And spread the love of Talking Real.
We love it when you do. So until next time, we'll see you next Tuesday on Talking Real.